Stay on the trail. Heed the signs. Never wander alone. These are the rules we all know but seldom follow. The wilderness calls to something primal within us, a yearning to explore, to discover, to conquer. But what if the wilderness is not merely indifferent to our presence? What if it hungers? National parks and forests span millions of acres across our nation, carefully maintained sanctuaries of natural beauty. We trust the uniformed guardians who patrol these wild spaces, those stoic figures with their wide-brimmed hats and stern warnings. They are there to protect us from the dangers of the wild, or so we've always believed. But what if some rangers serve a different master? What if their vacant eyes and too clean uniforms conceal something ancient and ravenous that has learned to wear human skin? In these three tales of terror, we follow those who strayed from marked paths and encountered the true wardens of the woods. Those who survived returned changed, haunted by questions that civilization cannot answer. What waits in the shadows between the trees? What feeds on the foolish and the lost? And most disturbing of all, how thin is the veneer between conservation and consumption? Watch if you dare, but remember, some trails once taken can never be left behind. And sometimes, the most terrifying predator in the forest is the one wearing a badge. Welcome to the darkness that dwells among the pines. Don't wander off the marked trails, the old ranger had warned us gruffly during orientation. His craggy face and intense stare made it seem more threat than friendly advice. I should have listened. The camping trip was supposed to be a chance to disconnect, to breathe fresh air, and escape the suffocating concrete jungle I called home. 4 days in Black Ridge National Forest sounded perfect, even with the cryptic warnings from locals about staying on designated paths. Small-town superstition, I thought. By the time I realized I'd strayed from the main path, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows through the dense canopy. At first, I wasn't worried. I'd taken plenty of hikes before, and my sense of direction had never failed me. But as minutes stretched into an hour, panic crept in. Every tree looked the same. Every path circled back to unfamiliar territory. A twig snapped somewhere behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. Hello? My voice sounded small against the vastness of the forest. Is someone there? Silence answered. Then a soft, muffled laughter drifted through the trees. Not the wholesome chuckle of a fellow hiker, but something wrong. Something that made my skin crawl. "This isn't funny," I called out, attempting to mask my fear with anger. "I'm lost. If you're a park ranger, I could use some help." More laughter, closer this time, coming from multiple directions. I turned slowly, scanning the dense foliage. Nothing. Just shadows deepening as daylight faded. My phone was useless. No signal, of course. The forest was known for being a dead zone, part of its appeal for those wanting to truly disconnect. Now, it felt like a trap. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think logically. Downhill. Water flows downhill, and water leads to civilization. I oriented myself toward what seemed like descending terrain and started walking with purpose. The sounds followed me, twigs breaking, leaves rustling, that laughter that seemed to be playing with me. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool evening air. Something wasn't right about this forest. Something wasn't right about that ranger either. The way he'd singled me out during orientation, his eyes lingering a beat too long. "You look like a wanderer," he'd said, his breath smelling of tobacco and something metallic. "The curious type who thinks rules don't apply to them." I'd laughed it off then. Now his words echoed in my mind with ominous significance. A clearing appeared ahead, bathed in the last golden rays of sunlight. Relief washed over me until I stepped into the open space and froze. There, carved into a massive oak, was a crude symbol, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward like a twisted sun. It looked fresh, the pale wood exposed beneath the dark bark. My eyes tracked to the other side of the clearing, another tree, another symbol, and another. The clearing was ringed with marked trees, each carving slightly different but undeniably related, like a written language I couldn't decipher. That's when I noticed the smell, metallic and organic, sickeningly sweet. The ground at the center of the clearing was darker than it should have been, the soil disturbed. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I needed to get the hell out of there. I turned to leave the way I came, but movement caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. My breath caught. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking. "I'm lost. Can you help me find the main trail?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, watching. Something about their stillness was profoundly unsettling. I took a step backward, then another. "I'm just going to go." The laughter erupted again, louder this time, coming from the figure. It was joined by another laugh from behind me, then another from my right. I spun around. More figures had emerged from the trees surrounding the clearing. They stood perfectly still, watching me with an unnatural stillness. "What do you want?" I shouted, fear giving way to desperation. The first figure stepped into the clearing. In the fading light, I could make out tattered clothing hanging from a gaunt frame. Long, matted hair obscured most of their face, but I could see their mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin that exposed too many teeth. "Just a little fun," a voice rasped, and I couldn't tell if it came from the figure before me or somewhere else entirely. "It's been so long since we've had a wanderer." The others began moving forward in a grotesque, shuffling manner, like puppets with half their strings cut. Their bodies jerked and twitched as they closed in around me. I bolted, finding a gap between two of them and running blindly into the forest. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step, but pure adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, that horrible laughter grew louder, more frenzied. They were enjoying hunting me. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, deeper into the unknown wilderness. The last light of day had vanished, leaving me stumbling through near-total darkness. Still, I ran until my foot caught on something solid, sending me sprawling onto the forest floor. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to my feet. Sprained, maybe broken, didn't matter. I couldn't stop. I limped forward, using trees for support. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but I didn't trust the silence. These woods played tricks. These things, whatever they were, knew the forest in ways I couldn't comprehend. A light flickered in the distance. Hope surged through me. A campsite, a ranger station, anything with people. Normal people. I hobbled toward it as quickly as my injured ankle would allow, ignoring the warning bells in my mind. It could be a trap. It could be them. But what choice did I have? As I drew closer, I realized it was a cabin, small and weathered, with a single lantern burning in the window. No car outside. No signs of regular habitation. A hunting cabin, maybe. Or an old ranger outpost. I reached the door and pounded desperately. "Hello, anyone? I need help." Nothing. I tried the handle. It turned easily, the door swinging open with a long creak. The interior was Spartan. A table, a chair, a small wood stove, and a narrow cot against the far wall. A lantern sat on the table, casting dancing shadows across the walls. No one was inside. I limped in and shut the door behind me, sliding a rusted bolt into place. It wouldn't hold against a determined attack, but it was better than nothing. My entire body trembled as the adrenaline wore off, attempting to make sense of what was happening. The walls of the cabin were covered with yellowed maps and faded photographs. I squinted at them in the dim lantern light. The maps showed the forest, marked with symbols similar to those I'd seen in the clearing. The photographs. I stood up, hobbling closer to get a better look. My blood ran cold. The photos showed people, hikers, campers, ordinary people smiling for the camera. But each photo had been altered, eyes scratched out, faces circled in what looked like dried blood. Some had crude symbols drawn over them, the same symbols from the trees. And there, in the center of the macabre display, was a familiar face. The old ranger from orientation, standing with a group of park staff. Unlike the others, his face wasn't defaced. Instead, a careful circle had been drawn around him, connecting to lines that spread outward to the other photos like a deranged spiderweb. A sound outside snapped me back to my immediate danger. Soft footsteps on the porch, that quiet, insidious laughter. "We know you're in there, wanderer," a voice called. "The old man's places don't keep us out. They're more like invitations." The old ranger. This was his cabin, and somehow he was connected to whatever was happening. "What are you?" I called out, grabbing the lantern and holding it like a weapon. "We are the forest," came the reply, followed by that unnerving laughter. "We are what happens to those who wander, those who are given to us." The doorknob rattled. The bolt held, but for how long? I scanned the cabin desperately for a weapon, a way out, anything. The window was too small to climb through. No back door. I was trapped. The rattling stopped abruptly. Silence fell, somehow more terrifying than the noise. Then a new voice spoke, deeper, authoritative. "That's enough play for tonight. This one's special." My heart skipped. I knew that voice. Heavy footsteps on the porch, followed by a sharp series of knocks. "Open up, it's Ranger Reed." The old man from orientation. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, clutching the lantern tighter. "I know you're scared," he continued, his voice deceptively gentle. "But those things out there won't leave until I tell them to. I'm your only way out of these woods alive." "Why should I trust you?" I shouted. "What the fuck is going on?" A deep sigh filtered through the door. "The forest has appetites, has for centuries. Long before this was a national park, the local tribes knew to stay away, called it the devouring ground." I glanced at the photographs on the wall. "And what? You feed it hikers? Tourists?" "Not me," he replied, sounding almost offended. "I'm just the caretaker. I try to keep people on the paths where it's safe, but there's always one who doesn't listen." The doorknob turned again, more insistently. "I can help you survive the night," he continued, "but you have to let me in. Now." My options were non-existent. Whatever waited in the forest was circling the cabin, occasionally scratching at the walls like animals testing for weakness. The ranger was connected to them somehow, but at least he was human. Maybe I could reason with him, maybe I could fight him. With trembling hands, I unbolted the door and stepped back, lantern raised. The old ranger entered, his massive frame filling the doorway momentarily before he shut the door behind him and re-bolted it. He looked exactly as he had during orientation. Weathered face, deep-set eyes, ranger uniform crisp despite the wilderness surrounding us. "Smart choice," he said, surveying me with an appraising gaze. "You're hurt." "No shit," I spat. "What are those things out there?" He moved to the wood stove and began building a fire with practiced efficiency. "The hungry ones, the lost, those who wandered too far, too long ago to remember being human." The fire caught, casting new light and heat into the small space. He gestured for me to sit. "They were like you once, wanderers, rule breakers. And you, what, fed them to the forest?" My voice cracked with a mixture of fear and rage. He shook his head slowly. "I tried to warn you, all of you, but some people can't help themselves." He looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "The forest always claims its price. Been that way since before white men came here. The difference is the tribes knew better than to wander." "So what happens now?" I asked, clutching the lantern so hard my knuckles turned white. He studied me for a long moment. "Usually, you join them, become part of the hunger. But..." Hope flickered dangerously in my chest. But sometimes the forest wants something different." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Sometimes it needs a new caretaker." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "I've been here 43 years, he said, suddenly looking every day of his age. "I'm tired, and the forest, it chose you." "That's insane," I whispered. "I'm not staying here. I'm getting out at first light and reporting all of this." He laughed, a sound unnervingly similar to those outside. "No one would believe you. And you wouldn't make it 10 feet from this cabin without my protection, but..." He held up the paper. "Sign this, and I'll lead you safely out tomorrow. I'll even drive you to the bus station myself." "What is it?" "A transfer of duty. Once you're safely away, think about what you've seen. When you're ready, come back. Take my post." He smiled thinly. "The forest is patient. It can wait until you accept your role." Outside, the scratching intensified, accompanied by that terrible laughter. They were listening. "And if I refuse?" His smile faded. "Then I can't protect you anymore, simple as that." I stared at the paper, then at the photographs on the wall, then back at the ranger's weathered face. The fire popped in the silence, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls like reaching fingers. "Do I have your word?" I asked finally. "You'll get me out safely?" He nodded solemnly. "The forest honors its bargains. So do I." With shaking hands, I signed the paper. What choice did I have? The scratching outside stopped immediately. The forest fell silent. "Get some sleep," he said, folding the paper away. "Dawn comes early, and we have a long walk out." I lay on the narrow cot, every nerve in my body still firing with fear and adrenaline. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion eventually won. I dreamed of trees with hungry faces, of laughter that echoed endlessly, of a forest that waited with infinite patience. When I woke, the ranger was gone, but he'd left his jacket and badge on the chair with a note. "The forest chose well. When you're ready, the path will appear. Until then, warn the others. Keep them safe. Keep them on the trails." I made it out of those woods somehow, following markers that appeared just when I needed them most. I've never told anyone the full story until now, but sometimes I still hear that laughter in my dreams. And lately, I've been feeling a strange pull, a yearning to return to those dark woods. I think I'm almost ready. Just promise me one thing. If you ever go hiking, stay on the goddamn trail. I fucked up. Simple as that. You don't get separated from your group when hiking the Black Ridge Trail. Everyone knows that rule. But there I was, lagging behind to take photos of some stupid mushrooms, and when I looked up, they were gone. The trail had seemed so straightforward in the daylight. Now, with the sun dropping fast behind the mountain ridge, every fork looked the same. Every tree, identical. I picked up my pace, the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders as the panic set in. "Hello?" I called out, nothing but the hollow echo of my voice against ancient pines. "Anyone there?" Darkness crept in fast between the trees, and the temperature dropped with it. I pulled my jacket tighter and fumbled for my headlamp. The battery was low. Another rookie mistake. I'd meant to change it before the hike, but got distracted. The dim beam barely cut through the growing gloom. That's when I saw him. About 50 yards ahead, just off the trail, stood a park ranger. Relief flooded through me as I jogged toward him. "Thank God," I called out. I got separated from my... I stopped cold. Something was wrong. He stood perfectly still, unnaturally so, his eyes fixed on me. No movement, no acknowledgement, just staring. "Excuse me?" My voice cracked. "Can you help me find the main trailhead?" Nothing, not even a blink. I stepped closer, and my skin crawled. His uniform was pristine. Too pristine for someone who'd been working in these woods all day. And his eyes. Jesus, his eyes were empty. Not cruel or kind. Just vacant, like looking into two black holes. "I need to get back to the parking lot," I tried again, backing away slightly. He didn't move, didn't respond. Just kept staring at me with those dead eyes. The trail ahead seemed clearer than turning back into the deep woods, so I edged past him, keeping as much distance as possible. I could feel his gaze boring into my back long after he disappeared from view. My pace quickened to a near jog. The trail twisted through dense undergrowth, each sound amplified in the growing darkness. Every snap of a twig sent jolts of adrenaline through my system. I rounded a bend and froze. Another ranger stood 20 feet ahead, positioned just like the first, perfectly still, hands at his sides. As I approached, he slowly turned his head toward me. Those same vacant eyes locked onto mine. "What the fuck is going on?" I whispered to myself. I backtracked quickly, looking for another path. The trail forked, and I took the right branch, moving faster now, my breath coming in short gasps. A third ranger, this one was partially hidden behind a large oak, only his silhouette visible until I got closer. Same blank stare, same unnervingly clean uniform. Panic set in fully now. I turned and ran, no longer caring about staying on the path. Branches tore at my face and arms. I tripped over roots and scrambled back up, driven by a primal fear I'd never experienced before. The trail seemed to loop endlessly. Every time I thought I was making progress, I'd spot another of those figures in the distance, always watching, always silent. My lungs burned. Sweat soaked through my clothes despite the cold. I burst into a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath, my hands on my knees. When I looked up, my blood turned to ice. They surrounded me. 7, maybe 8 of those rangers forming a perfect circle at the edge of the clearing. Not moving, not speaking, all watching with those soulless eyes. I spun around looking for any gap in their ring, any chance to escape. That's when I heard it, a low, rattling growl from the darkness beyond them. One of the rangers shifted slightly and the gap revealed something moving in the woods. Something large, something that shouldn't exist. I caught glimpses of matted fur, of limbs that bent at impossible angles. Hungry eyes, not vacant like the rangers, but filled with malevolent intelligence, glinted in the meager moonlight. The rangers moved in perfect unison, closing their circle, herding me toward whatever waited in the darkness. "No," I choked out, backing away until I tripped over a fallen log and landed hard. As I scrambled backward, my hand touched something cold and smooth. Not wood or earth, but metal. A trail marker, long forgotten and overgrown. Looking around frantically, I saw dozens of them, each marking paths that had been deliberately obscured. The horrific truth hit me like a physical blow. These weren't rangers, they were something else. Lures, shepherds, guiding lost hikers toward whatever monstrosity hunted these woods. The growling grew louder, branches snapped as it approached, the circle tightened. Just as I was about to make one final desperate dash, something unexpected happened. The growling shifted, becoming a different pitch. The rangers froze, their heads turning in unison toward the sound. From the opposite side of the clearing, another growl answered the first, then another, and another. The circle broke as the rangers turned to face this new threat. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I scrambled to my feet and bolted through the gap, running blindly into the woods. Behind me, sounds erupted that will haunt my nightmares forever. Inhuman shrieks, the wet tearing of flesh, the cracking of bones. Something was fighting over prey, and I was determined not to be it. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor, gasping for air. As I lay there, I became aware of something, the distant sound of traffic. Somehow, in my blind panic, I'd stumbled toward civilization. I forced myself up and staggered toward the sound. 10 minutes later, I broke through the tree line onto a highway. A passing trucker found me wandering along the shoulder, covered in dirt and blood from countless scratches, babbling about rangers with dead eyes. The official report says I got lost, panicked, and hallucinated from dehydration and exhaustion. Maybe that's true. It's certainly easier to believe. But I know what I saw. I know what waits in those woods, wearing ranger uniforms and guiding lost hikers to their doom. I know about the things that hunt there, and apparently the things that hunt the hunters. I still wake up some nights drenched in sweat, those empty eyes hovering in the darkness above my bed. On really bad nights, I hear that growl outside my window. I'll never set foot in those woods again. But sometimes I wonder if I ever truly left them. When we signed up for the glamping package at Pine Shadow National Park, we expected a guided tour through some of nature's greatest wonders. What we got instead was a lanky, dead-eyed ranger who hardly spoke, except to mouth dark hints about the sacrifice required by the old inhabitants of these woods. I'll never forget the blood-curdling screams echoing through those pines on the last night of our trip. It started idyllic enough: plush canvas tents nestled in a secluded forest glade, gourmet camp cuisine prepared over an open fire, and miles of pristine trails to explore. The first few days were a much-needed respite from the stresses of city life. My wife Joanna and I had been working ourselves to death at our respective law firms, and this trip was supposed to be our chance to reconnect. But our guide, Ranger Everett, cast a pall over the entire experience with his dour demeanor and cryptic mutterings. "These woods awoke something dark, long ago," he intoned one night while we dined on cedar-planked salmon. "The old inhabitants called it 'he who walks the blackened path.' They tried to appease it through ritual sacrifice." His beady eyes bore into each of us in turn. "One of you may be called upon to make that sacrifice before we depart these woods." An uncomfortable silence fell over our group until one of the other guests, a bubbly retiree named Marjorie, let out an awkward laugh. "You're just having us on, aren't you, trying to spook the city slickers?" She nudged me with an elbow. "Some over-the-top ghost story to add to the authenticity of being out in the wilderness." Ranger Everett's face remained solemn. "The scars on these trees and rocks bear witness to darker times. I pray we don't awaken what slumbers beneath." With that, he turned and retreated to his secluded campsite, leaving us to ponder his ominous words in the flickering glow of the dying fire. Joanna squeezed my hand under the table. "Maybe we should have gone to Cancun instead," she whispered, only half joking. Over the next 2 days, Everett's behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He'd spend long stretches crouched before the largest pine, murmuring inaudible chants and tracing indecipherable symbols in the loamy soil with a gnarled stick. I caught him once at dawn, standing naked in a small clearing, his pale skeletal body covered in some kind of dark mud, his eyes rolled back in his head. "Did you see him this morning?" I asked Joanna as we prepared for our daily hike. "I think the guy's having some kind of breakdown." She frowned, zipping up her fleece. "I reported it to the park office before we left. They said they'd send someone out to check on him, but I don't think they took it seriously. Said he'd been working here for 20 years without incident." During our guided hikes, he'd veer off the trail, beckoning us to follow him deeper into the shadowy woods with urgency in his eyes, as if being called by some unseen force. Those who hesitated found their path blocked by low-hanging branches until they acquiesced. "What the hell is out here anyway?" demanded Richard, a stockbroker from Seattle who'd been complaining since day one about the spotty cell service. "The brochure said we'd see waterfalls and wildlife, not creepy fucking trees." Everett ignored him, pushing aside a curtain of moss to reveal a small, dark cave opening. "The old ones made their offerings here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you hear them calling?" I strained my ears, but heard nothing except the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. The rest of our group, 6 couples in all, exchanged nervous glances. "This isn't on the itinerary," Richard persisted, checking his watch. "We were supposed to be back at camp by 4 for that wine tasting thing." Everett turned slowly, his normally vacant eyes suddenly bright with something that made my stomach clench. "Some things supersede schedules," he said softly. "Some hungers must be fed." That night, no one mentioned the strange detour or the ranger's increasingly erratic behavior. We ate our gourmet meal in near silence, the tension thick enough to cut with the steak knives we used on our perfectly grilled ribeyes. Even Marjorie's usual cheerful chatter had been reduced to nervous small talk about the weather. On our final night, as we prepared for dinner around the campfire, Everett emerged from between the tent lines, face flush with a feverish intensity. "It's time," he rasped, those dead eyes sweeping across our fearful group. "One of you must appease the ancient debt before the sun sets on these woods again." With surprising swiftness, he lunged forward and seized Marjorie by the arm, wrapping one bony hand around her mouth to stifle her screams. "Let her go, you psycho," Richard shouted, rising to his feet. Everett bared his teeth in a grotesque snarl and shook his head violently. "She's been chosen," he hissed, dragging the terrified woman toward the tree line despite her muffled protests. "The rest of you will stay here and bear witness." We could only watch in stunned horror as he hauled Marjorie deeper into the forest until the shadows swallowed them both. Then, the screaming began. A soul-rending primal outpouring of agony and fear that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. "We have to do something," Joanna said, grabbing my arm. Her nails dug into my flesh. "We can't just let him—" "I'll go," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "Richard, you come with me. Everyone else, stay together and be ready to run if we don't come back in 15 minutes. Richard looked like he might protest, but his wife gave him a shove. "Go," she urged. That poor woman. Armed with nothing but our camping flashlights and a kitchen knife I'd grabbed from the dinner setup, we plunged into the darkness after them. The screaming continued, seeming to bounce off the trees from all directions. "This way," Richard hissed, pointing to a faint path I hadn't noticed before. Broken twigs and disturbed undergrowth suggested someone had come this way recently. We followed the trail for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. The screams grew louder, more desperate, until suddenly they stopped, leaving an eerie silence broken only by our labored breathing. "Fuck," Richard whispered. "Do you think she's—" A new sound interrupted him, a low rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. We rounded a bend in the path and froze. In a small clearing stood Ranger Everett, backlit by a ring of small fires. Marjorie lay on a crude stone altar at the center, her body unnaturally still. The ranger's hands and face were smeared with something dark and wet that glistened in the firelight. "Jesus Christ," Richard breathed. As if hearing him, Everett's head snapped up, those dead eyes finding us in the darkness. His face split into a terrible grin. "You've come to witness after all," he said. "Good. The old ones appreciate an audience." "What have you done to her?" I demanded, gripping the knife tightly. "Given her to those who hunger," he replied simply, "as I must do with one of you now that you've intruded upon the sacred rite." He moved with inhuman speed, crossing the clearing before I could raise the knife. His hand closed around my throat, cutting off my air. I slashed blindly with the blade, feeling it connect with something solid. Everett didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice as blood welled from a gash across his chest. "The vessel matters not," he intoned, his voice suddenly different, deeper, resonant with something ancient and malevolent. "The flesh is merely a conduit." Richard barreled into him from the side, breaking his grip on my throat. I gasped for air as the two men crashed to the ground, grappling in the dirt. Everett was stronger than his lanky frame suggested, pinning the heavier man with ease. "Run!" Richard shouted at me. "Get the others and—" His words ended in a wet gurgle as Everett's hand plunged into his chest with impossible force. I stood frozen, watching in horrified disbelief as the ranger pulled his hand free, clutching something dark and pulsing. "The offering is accepted," Everett said, raising Richard's still beating heart to the night sky. The fires around the clearing surged higher, casting shadows that seemed to move with minds of their own. I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the trees, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I heard a sound no human throat should be able to make, a roaring, chittering howl that echoed through the forest. Somehow I found my way back to the campsite, bursting into the circle of light where the others waited anxiously. "We need to go now," I gasped, grabbing Joanna's arm. "Where are the car keys? We need to—" "What happened? Where's Richard?" his wife demanded, her face pale with fear. "Dead," I said flatly. "That fucking ranger killed him. Killed them both. We need to leave before he comes back." No one questioned me. We grabbed only what we could carry and raced to the parking area a quarter-mile from the campsite. Two couples piled into our SUV. Richard's wife and the remaining pair took the other vehicle. The engines roared to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness as we sped down the narrow access road. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the middle of the road, silhouetted against the night. Not the lanky form of Ranger Everett, but something else. Something taller, broader, with too many limbs moving in impossible ways. "Don't look back," I told Joanna, who had twisted in her seat. "Just don't." We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached the nearest town with a police station. The officers listened to our frantic tale with increasing skepticism until Richard's wife, in a voice devoid of emotion, demanded they investigate the disappearance of her husband and Marjorie. 2 days later, a search party found the glamping site exactly as it had been advertised. Plush tents, a gourmet kitchen setup, and trails clearly marked. No sign of violence, no altar, no ring of fires, no bodies. "You're Ranger Everett?" the lead detective told us later. "No employee by that name has ever worked at Pine Shadow National Park. The guide assigned to your group called in sick the day you arrived. According to the park management, you all insisted on proceeding without a replacement guide." "That's not possible," I protested. "He was with us the whole time. We have the booking records, sir," the detective interrupted, sliding a folder across the table. "No guide assigned, no evidence of foul play. And as for your missing companions, their belongings were gone as well. No sign of a struggle." I opened my mouth to argue further, but Joanna squeezed my hand in warning. The look in her eyes told me what I already suspected. They wouldn't believe us. In the weeks that followed, Richard and Marjorie were officially listed as missing persons, presumed to have wandered off trail and gotten lost in the vast wilderness surrounding the park. The rest of us were questioned repeatedly, our stories dissected for inconsistencies. Eventually, I stopped telling the truth. We all did. It was easier to accept the official version, that stress and isolation had led to mass hysteria, that we'd imagined or exaggerated the strange ranger and his ritualistic behavior. But I know what I saw in those woods. I know what waits there, hungry and ancient, accepting its sacrifices through whatever vessel presents itself. Sometimes I wake in the night, certain I can hear that otherworldly howl echoing through our suburban bedroom, calling me back. I'll never set foot in those woods again, because no matter how far I travel, part of me will always remain there, trapped among the pines, haunted by the echoes of those horrific screams and the knowledge that something old and ravenous continues to feed on unwitting travelers who venture too deep into its domain. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I check the missing persons databases. The numbers around Pine Shadow National Park continue to grow year after year. And sometimes, in the grainy photos of the search parties, I catch a glimpse of a familiar figure in the background, a lanky ranger with dead eyes, leading another group of tourists off the beaten path.